No swaggy intro this week. I don't deserve it. Welcome to the MMA RAXPOD, degenerates, degeneritas, and degenerati. It is Wednesday morning, just shy of noon, in Miami, Florida, and I'm still licking my wounds from one of the worst weekends I've had this year. I would say the worst probably since at least UFC 289. But overall, I think my worst weekend before this was probably the one, I believe it was back in March. Sandhagen Vera, yes, that was probably my worst weekend before this. But I had many more picks that night. So I was able to do much better than just hitting one, which is what happened, unfortunately, at the Apex last weekend at UFC Vegas 80. Obviously not anywhere close to standards. Not even hitting a money line was pretty brutal. I didn't feel very confident after that in the under that I had for either of the fights. One of them ends up getting canceled, and that's super tragic given we had both of them as parlay legs. And then Pyfer Razak Al Hassan, after that first round, there was no reason to feel good that that fight was going to end. I mean, it was obscene, the shots from Pyfer that Razak Al Hassan was just eating despite getting his guard split. And I had no reason to think a knockout was coming in the second round. And I was thankfully bailed out by Pyfer realizing he could just pick this dude up and ragdoll him and going for the arm triangle from there. Now, even despite Razak Al Hassan tapping out with strikes, I forget who the ref was, but I still thought, oh, there's a chance that they may just end up letting this go because this guy wasn't actually tapping or what have you. But still less than 30 seconds away from not hitting on that under 1.5, and that would have been my first reverse sweep ever, which would have been a tough pill to swallow given, since at least International Fight Week I've been talking all this shit. So I got to bounce back. Thankfully, the only favorite I ended up not hitting, because again, I called Hernandez when he was plus odds and then the line flipped, so I'm not going to count that as a favorite miss, but I did, I was pretty vocal about not thinking Aljo was very good, and it turned out to be the opposite. Or perhaps Hernandez just didn't measure up. I just wasn't willing to say, oh, he's been fraud checked already the way others had. But that one still hurts to miss. Aljo's been a bit of a boogeyman, and so is Hernandez. So I was worried about what my read for that fight was going to be anyway. Same can be said about Johnny Munoz, who's really the favorite that I should have. There was no avoiding last week just because of the slim pickings, but just going forward, the lesson that I'm taking from Munoz losing is I knew the guy was a guard goblin. There's another guard goblin on this card that I'm going to talk about. It probably won't come into play, but may surprise some people the name that's going to be associated with that term. But we knew from the Santos fight that Munoz was a guy that will go to his instinctive strength, which is his jiu-jitsu, even from what he considers to be a neutral position, despite the fact that in MMA it's simply not treated as the same. Now, this is a common misconception that grapplers have when making the transition to the sport. And I've spoken before how the reason I make numbers the stake of my analysis is that they represent long-term patterns of behavior. And that is in a fight or flight scenario, those kinds of behaviors are what humans instinctively fall back into, such as when they're in the octagon. And you saw this once again with Johnny Munoz this past weekend. When he fought Santos, the instinct was to pull guard to protect himself, given he was, getting repeatedly kicked in the groin area. In this case, he got hurt against Ariki Long late. He did a good job winning the first round outright when he, had a full gas tank available. But as the damage was beginning to set in from the second round and going into the third, Munoz just was too content to hunt for a submission from his back and protect himself in what he considered a neutral position, and it ended up costing him the fight. So, knowing that this was a bit of a low-level fight, there had been criticism that Ariki Long hadn't really beaten anyone, but I had thought he at least faced better competition than perhaps what Munoz has. There were concerns about both of their damage tolerance. Obviously, it still ends up going to the guy with the edge in the striking and Ariki Long, but it was very evident who was going to have the upside relative to the striking. Guys that have this exemplary jiu-jitsu background, such as the one that Munoz does, if they haven't really elevated themselves to the higher levels of MMA yet, it's probably best to exercise caution on betting them going forward if you recognize that they are someone that regularly pulls guard in the way that Munoz does. Not every fighter that starts out as a jiu-jitsu ace, pans out in terms of that kind of style. Some of them recognize that MMA is a different rule set. The judges are looking at different criteria, and in many cases, submissions should only be used as a mechanism for returning to your feet rather than an outright offensive weapon, or in other situational cases, a fight-ending tool, such as when defending takedowns with a guillotine, or if you're able to secure a back take during a scramble or a wrestling exchange. A rear naked choke is the most common and effective submission available to any fighter. So there are ways to use it correctly, submissions within the MMA rule set. Some of these grapplers that make it the entire base of their offense, it's very, very rare and difficult for a fighter to outright excel at that at the UFC level. So it's just something we need to take into account when evaluating these fighters going forward. I will certainly have that in mind when grading fighters in the pick'em range, such as what this fight was in the past week. That is striker versus grappler in a close matchup. Is the grappler a regular guard puller with a combat sports background that has ingrained that habit in him? So, anywho, we move on. It is what it is. And we are on to UFC Vegas 81. And I'll be eager to, get back on the right track, because this is October, and we've only got probably, if last year was any indication, we'll hopefully get 3 events in December. I would imagine there would be Thanksgiving off, so we'll probably get 3 events in November. We've had 1 event this month, and we'll say we get 3 more, I believe, this month. So we're looking at less than 10 more opportunities to make money this year. So let's see if we can do as much as we can. We could lose every weekend until the end of the year under those circumstances and still come out at, I believe, 98 units. So that would be cool. But, it'd be cooler to have a 100-unit year on only parlays, right? Or even a 200-unit year. So, let's see what we can do. I will say, if you listened last week, then you heard me talking about how I was like, this card just with the weird cancellations already and shit feels like the end is nigh in terms of the streak of hitting a parlay and whatever. And that ended up being the case. So I could feel it in my gut. You heard me, if you listened all the way through, you heard me get emotional talking about Carolina. And then you saw her get emotional again after she won her fight. And then she told you why, because it's, not only what I referenced about, the struggles in her own personal life, but she also literally left her family behind in Poland to come over here and try to revitalize her MMA career. And even though she's obviously been successful, there's a toll that takes. So for her to go from a 5-fight losing streak to a 4-fight winning streak within the last 2 years, starting from last year, it's really commendable what she's done. And she was available at -155. And that would have been a better parlay leg. And if I had used that instead of Hernandez or Munoz, I would have been profitable last week. But I didn't want to invest in my emotions. Even though my emotions were telling me I was going to lose based on the men's picks that were available. So I should have trusted my instincts. But I just kind of went with the blind analysis because it had been working. So these are sometimes when you're betting at this level, you just got to take a step back and really examine what your instincts are telling you relative to what all the data says and all the variables. And that is a mistake that I would make last year, and it is a mistake that I am still making now. And it is something that I will need to correct going forward, but I'm committed to being transparent and letting you all know that, and because this is only the second year I've been doing this. And we're already clinching profitability. We're 2 units of profit away from a 100-unit year on only parlays. I don't know if that's unheard of, but I know there's some people that do props and parlays only, but I mean, for a 10-unit a week strategy that thrives on only parlays, I'm pretty proud of what I've been able to accomplish this year on a public ledger. That is Twitter. I know some people are upset about that, but, I'm sure I'll be on a podcast sooner or later that will have a bigger platform and I can get grilled for that and explain myself away there. Okay, that's enough wallowing in my misperformance from last weekend. Time to look forward and make up for it. So, UFC Vegas 81, and we will start with the first men's fight of the evening featuring 2 combatants that have previously competed in the UFC, Chris Gutierrez and Alateng Haley. Gutierrez is one of my favorites on the whole roster. It was devastating to see him get pancaked by Pedro Munoz, the leg kick cheeser, but that's kind of the thing with fighting Munoz, is that if you're one of these bantamweights that makes your name on low leg kicks, Munoz is the kind of guy that not only will beat you at your own game with relative ease, he will also take you down and just make the fight miserable for you and grind out a decision, even at his age. I think his fight style actually ages pretty gracefully, and we might see him do that to some rising contenders in that weight class for a couple more years for that exact reason. And it helps that he has an uncrackable chin. Alateng Haley has a much worse chin. And I think that's why you've seen this line explode out to what it has as this fight got locked in on short notice, given both guys lost their respective opponents and have now been rebooked for each other. However, it's become somewhat apparent that Gutierrez has, despite the shortcoming against Munoz, he at least competed in the UFC this year, whereas Haley has not competed in about 13 months. Haley, interesting fighter to get a read on because the indication is, and from his look you would think he's got wrestling available, but he's very inconsistent about using it, and he's sometimes far too content to strike. He also his UFC debut was very, very controversial because he very much should have lost to Batgerald Dana, but he was fighting in China, and it was quite obvious that he was given favorable judging that evening relative to what ended up being one of his bigger performances in his UFC career thus far. I do remember watching some of his fights, and in particular the Dana fight, and knowing that Dana was a power hitter. Watching Haley absorb strikes in that fight made me optimistic that he had better damage tolerance that the multiple KOs on his record, or losses by KO on his record, would have hinted at. So I speculatively figured he was going to hold up against Kevin Kroom, and I took the over in that fight instead of betting on Haley when I had Haley graded a win. And I was, color me shocked. Kroom moving down 2 weight classes probably shouldn't have been expected to do well at bantamweight, and Haley, who really had not shown any knockout power at the UFC level prior to that, dispatched Kroom very quickly, who ended up having absolutely no damage tolerance. So Kroom is since out of the UFC. I took the over again when Haley fought Chad. I'm going to totally butcher his name. Onheliger? Okay. That was UFC 279 last year. So I felt good about taking it then because I knew Onheliger wasn't going to be the same power hitter nor liability that Kroom did. And Kroom not necessarily power hitter, but just had an extreme reach advantage in that case. But my point in listing all this is that Haley, when you look at what the numbers represent and then how his UFC career actually is played out, and there's a lot of contrasting. The eye test does not match what the data says. Like this guy is not as good as his 4-1-1 record in the UFC, I think, demonstrates. So it makes sense to me that the line is widened this week the way we've seen it. And it's important to remember that Gutierrez, even as this line grows, this was a guy that was getting disrespected as early as last year. I talk about my mythical UFC Columbus run from March 26th of last year, and Chris Gutierrez played a vital role in that evening. One of the 3 straight underdogs I called to start the night. I'm not going to say called because this wasn't public. This was just me playing by myself at this point. But Gutierrez to beat Dana, because I figured Dana was just being favored because of the power that he had demonstrated. But I watched his fight with Haley, and even though I thought he beat Haley, I didn't think he necessarily did enough in that fight to merit being considered a favorite in all of the fights that he had been on to that point. And he continued to be favored even after that, and ended up not really having much success even though I think he was on his way to beating Brady Highstand. And I picked Highstand in that case, and Highstand got a bit lucky at the end. But Gutierrez was the underdog against Dana, got the spinning back fist KO, then fought Frankie Edgar, looked a light years ahead of Edgar just because Edgar was, old at that point and was very, very much ripe for a flying knee, a standing knee, or just getting caught by someone with faster pace. So it made sense that heading into the Munoz fight, Gutierrez was carrying the price tag that he did. He had those two spectacular knockouts back to back, but I do believe the Dana one not only is a spinning back fist, a bit of a meme, but it also happened against someone who I believe was a bit overvalued in Dana. And even in overvalued, I still think that guy rightfully beat the opponent that Gutierrez now finds himself matched up with in this case. Gutierrez has like the best hip feints in the UFC. Like, he's so good at throwing his hips to like set up, like getting opponents to bite and then kicking the other direction. Or I mean, none of the strikes that he throws with his fists are ever going to get knockouts. Like, even though he's got 9 KOs, many of them are attrition based or, set up by kicks. He's obviously got one of the only low leg kick TKOs in UFC history against Vince Morales. But he's not really a guy that throws with power in his fists. He's more committed to using his hips for feint setups that just kind of let him effectively chain strikes at all times during the fight. And he has the pretty good cardio to set that up. The concern is, and this was demonstrated in the Cody Durden fight, and in the Munoz fight as well, and I think that's part of the reason that there were a lot of people taking Munoz against Gutierrez. When he gets taken down, his get-up game is not very good. So there is, I think, a little bit of liability here that if Haley does deploy the wrestling, which he is suited for in his frame, but is inconsistent with in practice, this fight could get a little messy, especially given the short notice. But you have to imagine Gutierrez was preparing for an opponent he was very much an underdog against last week in Montel Jackson, who figured to have better offensive wrestling available and had traditionally used it later in fights to secure decision victories. So you have to imagine Gutierrez, in light of having it on film that this is a way he can be stopped, has been very much refining his takedown defense and trying to better himself in the areas that are going to allow him to keep the fight on his terms. So I felt very confident betting him at 240 here against Haley. But this line, Gutierrez is like minus 450 now, a few days after I put this pick out. Now, I'm not going to go on, closing line value, I'm so good. Like, okay, whatever. I don't bet until the weigh-ins. Although in light of getting absolutely destroyed on every bad weight cut read on my end wrong this year, it might be finally time for me to start locking my parlays in earlier in the week, so that I avoid situations like this. But I do think this is a bit of a one-off. I mean, I usually don't have any problem with waiting until, the Friday at like a few hours after the weigh-ins finish. But it stinks to have Gutierrez graded out to like just shy of the 300 range, get him at a price I'm comfortable with, and then like 2 days before I'm going to record the show telling other people to go bet on it, I mean, it just falls all the way out to 450. The over 2.5 is interesting, but at 270, it feels so steep also. I typically don't ever like betting an over that's, above the 225. So I think doing that for bantamweights, particularly like Haley, we know his chin is bad. We just haven't seen it taken advantage of at the UFC level yet. You wonder if the speed of Gutierrez combined with the 13-month layoff of Haley is going to create a situation where in the first round, Gutierrez is able to catch him with something that he's not going to be anticipating the speed on. So I do think Gutierrez is going to win. It'll probably be a decision, but I don't think a first-round knockout is out of the question given Haley's layoff. I will say it's a decision, but I can't bet Gutierrez now. If you got him at the start of the week, good for you. At minus 450, it just feels irresponsible given what if Haley is able to take him down in only 2 of the rounds. We know Gutierrez is so bad at getting back up. Haley might just be able to lay on him. And a lay and pray might be all it takes. It was enough to get a draw for Cody Durden. And it was a nice compliment to the knockdown Munoz got on him himself that ultimately sealed the win for him in Gutierrez's last appearance. So don't bet this shit. The next fight is TJ Brown and Darren Elkins. The damage, or the damage, as David from Wallingsford upon Shirehampton calls him. TJ Brown, another fighter that I've had trouble getting a good read on while he's been in the UFC. I have faded TJ Brown, I believe, twice. First time was... No, that's not true. It might be true. But the first time wasn't when he fought Shilan Nurdenbeke. I did, in fact, actually take him in that fight. I've only faded him once, but I've backed him twice. I backed him against Shilan Nurdenbeke, and I backed him against Bill Algeo. That's how bad I thought Bill Algeo was, and now Algeo has made me look to be a fool on 2 straight favored events. But I also faded him against Eric Silva, and he ended up getting a late finish in that one, and Eric Silva did not look particularly great against him either. So I've had 3 straight bad reads on TJ Brown, and compare that to my history with Darren Elkins. I had Elkins graded to absolutely destroy Connolly. But after watching, this was in the infancy of my aggressive tape running phase last year where I was like, I'm going to run tape on the whole roster. Like everybody, every single card, 10 hours a week. Fuck yeah. And it, you end up watching that Connolly Michel Pereira fight. And in context, you understand why Connolly was able to do what he did, but still makes you think like, oh my God, Elkins will bleed if you breathe on Elkins incorrectly, he'll start bleeding. And what if Connolly's able to take advantage of that? So I had Elkins graded to crush him, but I decided to take the over just because I figured if Elkins controls this fight the way that he wants to, Elkins will probably take it to decision. And there was way less value, I think, on the over than there was on Elkins, even though Elkins was favored anyway. but it was a pick that I should have ridden with because Elkins really crushed him. And then against Jonathan Pierce, I believe I had Pierce graded to win, but not out to the favored range that he was, so I figured I'd take the under. And Pierce looked like he was in a position to maybe do that early in the third round, and the ref inexplicably stood them up or didn't give Pierce back the position after he was calling a foul or something. I can't quite recall what happened, but it was a bit of a controversy. In any event, Elkins, the guy is going to end up bleeding. And in this era of judging where damage is key, that's not good, even though the judges are told to approach blood as if it were sweat. And they really need to be more focused on cuts. The thing is, TJ Brown has proven to be a very inconsistent performer, and I know this because I have bet on him to win twice and watched him get blown up in the process 2 times. And we know Elkins can be a grinder when he wants to be. I think it's unrealistic to expect him to win this fight by finish, but we've seen TJ Brown fade consistently after the first round on several occasions. Against Nurdimbiki, he actually won the second round with, I think, a flurry of submission attempts and then ended up losing the third. But we saw him fade against Algeo, and he did beat Eric Silva, but again, that was a relatively low-level opponent, especially compared to a UFC veteran like Elkins. I think Elkins is going to be able to drag this fight to decision, which is very favorable to him because TJ Brown does not have a good history of late fight performance. Not only that, Elkins has more than 3 times as much experience both in the UFC and going to decisions compared to TJ Brown. So when you add all of those things together, it makes me think that Elkins is going to be able to turn this fight into a grindy, weird war that exhausts Brown in a way that he's able to eke out a 29-28, probably loses the first round, but is able to get warmed up after the first, and he's got to start bleeding, and then he's good to go. And then I think as Brown is a bit baffled at the fact that he hasn't been able to really dispatch Elkins in the way that he maybe expected, that's when Elkins begins to come on and Brown begins to tire out. And I believe that Elkins will then be in a better position to do more of what he wants offensively going into the third round. That continues. Elkins is able to get a unanimous 29-28. So I think at the current value, he's pretty good. Again, plus money is plus money. I went 0 for 3 on my plus money picks last week. So given my lifetime success, it seems as if I'm due for one to hit. But we will see. I still feel very, very good about my instincts with underdogs lifetime. So I think the experience here is gonna pay off very, very well. I don't think that the age gap between these two outweighs the amount of experience that Elkins has in this case, especially given the ways that we've seen Brown lose, not just in the UFC, but in MMA overall. So give me Darren Elkins. The next fight is Christian Rodriguez and Cameron Saaiman. Saaiman. Well, yeah, I've talked a lot about how I was at UFC 287. And if you remember my bets that night, then you know how much of a spoiler Christian Rodriguez was. That man cost me about 50 units this year. Devastating. Had a nice little parlay with Steve Garcia on there, Rob Font. Just couldn't quite get the units cleaned up because I missed one of the main legs and ended up walking out of there down 10 units and with a whole lot of fond memories for the rest of my sports fandom life. It was quite an event. But Christian Rodriguez did spoil it a little bit for me. So this is not a fade out of spite for that guy. I really did look at it and tried to think, because to be honest, I am a little bit surprised, given the success Saaiman has had at his early age, that he isn't actually favored in this case. Saaiman has demonstrated some issues. Fouling obviously is one of the concerns, but it can be a bit explained away by his young age and the lack of discipline that a lot of other young fighters have at this stage. We obviously saw how for an 18-year-old like Raul Rosas, that factored into him fighting Christian Rodriguez earlier this year. So experience is, as I was just alluding to in the Elkins versus TJ Brown fight, it's a very, very important factor to consider here when forecasting an extended exchange in combat sports. So the interesting thing here is that the experience is pretty consistent at the UFC level between these two, which wasn't necessarily the case when Rosas fought Rodriguez. Saaiman obviously has better momentum. He's the better striker here, I think, by far. Rodriguez is certainly going to have a wrestling advantage available. And it's interesting that I believe he's also going to have the reach advantage. Let me confirm that. Yeah, he is. So the only thing that Saaiman doesn't have going for him striking-wise, or the reach advantage, which is about 4.5 inches for Rodriguez. And Rodriguez is also a bit better defensively. But the offensive volume clearly goes to Saaiman, and Saaiman will also have the southpaw versus orthodox advantage as well. And the surprising thing is, even though Rodriguez gets labeled the better grappler or better wrestler, whatever you want to call it, in terms of deploying takedowns, Saaiman actually does it at greater volume and efficiency. Rodriguez has better takedown defense, so I would figure Saaiman would not try to test that and would be content to keep exchanging on the feet. But Rodriguez certainly has a path to controlling this fight, which I think that he's probably going to need to lean on, because Saaiman not only has the edge in volume here, but also power. And power that I believe he's demonstrated, at the Contender Series level in front of Dana White before. So I think given those offensive upsides for Saaiman, it's surprising that he isn't favored here. I think that Rodriguez has a lofty appearance given the fact that he upset Rosas and is now in a position to also derail another rising prospect very, very early into his UFC career. But Saaiman is certainly more disciplined, I think, than a guy like Rosas has demonstrated to be. Even though Saaiman is only 5 years older, if that, possibly only 4. So I do very much like Cameron Saaiman here. I think he's good value. I call him a plus 138, I believe, and he's since fallen to about plus 130. I would hope that he gets a finish, but I don't think that Rodriguez should be favored here, given he has more specific paths to winning than Saaiman does. And I think that Rosas's lack of striking put Rodriguez in a position where he was able to overperform his last price tag. So I do think that there's a bit of front runner bias here, just because Rodriguez is very young and inexperienced in himself, and I look for it's kind of a shame that these guys are getting matched up with each other, because you would think they would want to foster both of these prospects and then have them fight later on, but perhaps they're getting their match in now, and we'll get a bantamweight rematch as a main event or something when these guys are both a bit more seasoned, maybe in 5 years. That would be interesting to see. So I do think the future is bright for both of these guys, but it feels wrong to make Saaiman the underdog here, given the striking upside he has. And I also think he can give more resistance to Rodriguez in the grappling and on the ground than what Rodriguez is going to be able to give Saaiman in the striking. It's important to remember Saaiman, I think almost, if not did, give up mount to Terrance Mitchell and was still able to scramble out and escape and end up catching Mitchell in a finish of his own. So I think that Saaiman could surprise some people even if Rodriguez has success getting the fight to the floor. I think Saaiman is going to be able to get back up more quickly than people are perhaps anticipating. So give me Cameron Saaiman to pull off the upset. The next fight is Edgar Chairez and Daniel Lacerda. Okay, this pissed me off. Like, let's be very frank about this. All right? Daniel Lacerda pulled some shit at UFC Noche. Chairez beat him. Lacerda did not have to go limp. I don't understand what the benefit of going limp in that situation is, particularly when the ref is visibly checking on you to make sure you're okay. You know the ref is in your vicinity, and you display that body language to them. He did that intentionally so that he could have a cop-out as, oh, I wasn't out and you made a mistake, and he really tried to put the blame on Tognoni, which a lot of people have since forgiven him for. But some people only saw the first video, and they've never been able to get over it since, because they haven't gotten any additional context or cared to. The thing that really sucks is that now that the fight is rebooked, I mean, it's not like the Jimmy Crute Alonzo Mendes, although that didn't end in a no contest. That ended in a draw. I don't know what would be a good example for a fight that gets rebooked so quickly like this one has, like a month later. But it just stinks that we saw Chairez win, and so that has inflated his line out to the 300 range now. And I thought one of the things going for Chairez was that he was fighting at UFC Noche as a Mexican fighter, and he doesn't have that in this random Apex event now. They're presumably in a smaller cage, and that changes the dynamic a little bit. So rather than, especially given how the last fight played out, where Lacerda actually did manage to get Chairez on the ground, and even though Chairez was able to get back to his feet and sneak in a choke, smaller cage, much more expensive price tag on Chairez, and Lacerda's desperate. He is super desperate now to win, particularly after he probably made some enemies in MMA circles particularly with the refs, with the shit that he tried to pull on Tognoni. So that kind of desperation, a wild man like how he fights, how's that going to go? The under, I think, is maybe worth looking at. I'll take a peek at it right now. The under 1.5 is minus 185. That's very interesting because this fight ended in the first round the first time, but we also know Lacerda's never been to a decision. So you can take the over there because it's the middle of the fight. But given this fight ended in the first round last time, how comfortable can you really feel with that? So the best move here is just not to play, especially because Chairez is now out to like 340. You just can't move on this. Somebody was asking me, like, you bet him last month and he won, so like, why wouldn't you just run it back? And I just don't feel comfortable with this price tag. I just don't. I wish that he was a 200 again. I could maybe talk myself into it then, even though I wouldn't technically have him graded out to there. But 350 for a guy that nearly was giving up position and was probably losing the round. I don't know about losing the round, but yeah, I just don't. At 350, you expect total domination. That's not what we were getting, and we know Lacerda's a wild man. So I just don't need this. And I will watch, and I'll hope that justice is served on Lacerda and all the people speculatingly betting him because, he's the best 0-5 fighter in UFC history or whatever. I don't want to hear it. So Chairez is my pick, I would say Chairez wins, but I'm not betting it this time. It's too expensive. I'll live with the fact that I was correct last month and Lacerda simply pulled one over on everybody and collapsed one of my parlay legs and cost me a profitable UFC noche. So hopefully justice will be served. The next fight is Michel Pereira and Andre Petroski. So I completely overlooked the fact that Pereira got a rebooking in the form of Petroski last week. And ESPN was pretty slow to update the fight card because not until this morning did I notice that they actually added this. And I overlooked it on Tapology and ShareDog, and even on the betting lines, it might have been available earlier in the week. I see that the over/under's already there, so I actually taped this one last in spite of all the work that I did for grading Yusuff Barboza yesterday. So Petroski, I made him a leg at UFC 292, and really, that was quite a fortunate parlay, if I'm being honest. It's amazing looking back on the 5-leg that I hit with Sean O'Malley that the Batista fight was closer than the score would have implied. The Vera Munoz fight was closer than the score would have implied. And Petroski narrowly beat Mearshart on a split. So 3 of my 4 legs needed some judging grace, and I got it. But it would be hard to call Petroski's last performance outright impressive, especially given the price he was at, and that he did not finish the fight strong, and in fact did allow Mearshart to actually beat him on significant strikes by the end of the fight, which for a guy as not sophisticated of a striker as Mearshart is a problem. He is a guy that's an MMA veteran, so I think once he gets comfortable and once he successfully deploys his style of fighting in terms of, it's kind of similar to what I've talked about with Duplessis and the muddy waters in terms of we both get tired and then I'm just going to have more left to throw than you at that stage because I'm more used to forging through that. Mearshart definitely the same in that regard and got Petroski to operate within that, within his world. And Petroski was still able to win. Again, closer than I would have liked, but I understood scoring it for Mearshart. But it would hard to say that I was impressed based on what we saw in his last fight. That being said, Michel Pereira is a 200 favorite here coming off a split decision himself. That was the last card, I believe, before I went public with MMA Rax. I remember being pretty proud of myself for hitting a pretty nice parlay that night. And Ponzinibbio, I thought he did come on pretty strong, but I was worried as they were reading out the judges' scorecards that they were going to give that to him when I thought Pereira had won the fight in the first 2 rounds at least. So I was grateful for some judging grace there too, but it's interesting when you look at the careers of both of these fighters relative to how some of their opponents have panned out, and neither one of these guys are really that impressive, but Pereira definitely not as impressive as I think is being advertised. So let me, just to walk you guys back through this real quick. Petroski's first UFC appearance is credited with being a tough semifinal loss to Brian Battle. And then he fought 3 opponents that are no longer on the UFC roster and finished all of them. And in his most recent 2 appearances against Wellington Turman and Gerald Mearshart, he went to decisions for the first times in his MMA career. Now, he had gone to the 3rd round in 2 previous UFC appearances as well and found finishes in each. But again, it speaks to a fighter that for most of their come-up is kind of used to just overwhelming their opponents early, which was the case in Petroski's first 3 MMA fights. And you've seen him kind of gradually, as he's met more resistance, taken a longer time to get through on his way to where he is right now. Now, you compare that to Pereira. Pereira knocked out Danny Roberts in his UFC debut, which I'm sure then was very impressive, but we've since come to realize how nuclear awful Roberts' chin is. The next fight that Pereira had is regarded as one of the most incredible upsets in UFC history, when Pereira was a 450 favorite and missed weight against Tristan Connolly and gassed almost immediately because he did too much capoeira shit in the beginning of the fight, and Connolly was able to rack up 5 minutes of control time and beat him on volume of strikes just because Pereira was depleted after already coming in heavy and botching his weight cut, presumably. So, one of the craziest upsets in UFC history. Connolly was fighting in front of his home Vancouver crowd, and it is a fight that is certainly worth watching if you haven't seen it before. Highly recommend it. Available on ESPN Plus. A must-watch for tape study mavens. Next fight gets DQ'd by gets DQ'd against Diego Sanchez. And he's on a 5-fight win streak since, but Zelim Imadaev never won in the UFC and is no longer in it, period. Chaos Williams was a more heralded name back in 2020 than he's gone on to be since. Nico Price has seen better days of late. The last time we saw him was getting floored outright by Robbie Lawler, and I believe he lost to Phil Rowe in his appearance before that. Andre Fialho, I believe that one of the reasons Fialho was so exalted for so long is because in Fialho's UFC debut, he actually took a round off of Pereira in what I believe was the final round. But that mostly just aligns with Pereira's poor experience or poor history of final round fighting, which followed up in his appearance after that against Ponzinibbio, in which Santiago was able to get more favorable opinions thrown his way on the third and final round than I think perhaps Pereira or his backers were expecting. So Pereira, there is a gassing risk here that I think is actually more significant than the one Petroski has, even though we saw it with Petroski when he fought Mearshart. I don't expect Pereira to weaponize cardio taking this fight at middleweight for what I believe is the first time in his career, after we've seen him previously struggle when he's had to operate heavy. Now, granted, that probably had something to do with botched weight miss when he fought Tristan Connolly, but this is still the first time we're seeing this fighter move up to add 15 pounds for a weight class. And he has a history of gassing late in final rounds. You have to think that extra weight he's carrying is going to come into play here versus a guy who's a natural middleweight like Petroski. Now, further complicating this for Pereira is because we don't really know what he's like at middleweight, we know that he's had to have enjoyed a huge size advantage at welterweight that helps explain his 94% takedown defense. So you have to wonder, when he's not fighting guys that are the size of Tristan Connolly or Zelim Imadaev or Nico Price, I don't know. Or he's not fighting strikers like Danny Roberts or Santiago Ponzinibbio or Andre Fialho or Chaos Williams. What is his takedown defense going to look like against a guy whose fight is actually tailored around wrestling and grappling? And this is the first time we've seen him fight someone comparable to him in size while he's moving up a weight class. There are way, way, way too many unknowns here with Pereira relative to Petroski. This fight really should be graded more narrowly than it is, or lined more narrowly than it is. But then the final factor to consider here that I think really puts it over the top for Petroski is he fought 2 months ago, and Pereira's been off for almost a year and a half. Now, I understand Pereira's had terrible luck during his UFC career with cancellations. Sergey Kandoskov, Muslim Salikov, Fialho canceled on him, I believe, once. Oh, no, that was rescheduled due to COVID, and then he won. But Sean Brady, that fight got canceled. The first time he was supposed to fight Stephen Thompson, it got rescheduled, and then Pereira missed weight. And now Marc-Andre Barriault is withdrawn on him as well. So Pereira's not necessarily a guy that bails on fights, but it has still created a situation for him where, because of Sean Brady and because of his misfire with Stephen Thompson, this guy has not competed in 17 months. And the guy he's fighting on short notice fought 3 months ago and won. against a guy with way more weaponizable cardio than what Pereira offers. And this guy's returning to middleweight as opposed to Pereira debuting there. Pereira, 2-1 favorite in this spot, just can't be trusted. And I think Petroski, after what he went through with Meerschaert, against a guy that is getting an unfamiliar test of a wrestler-grappler relative to his own striking prowess, if Pereira isn't able to put him away in the first round, what kind of game plan is Petroski able to deploy from there? And if they get to the third round and they're both tired, who has the history of edging it out and who has the history of fading away? I'm going to take Andre Petroski here at plus 170. And I would like to see more of Michel Pereira, but it is unfortunate he keeps facing cancellations. This would be a good win for him, but even this win, it's not what we want to see him fight Sean Brady. We want to see him fight Stephen Thompson. We need to see the levels up in competition here, because Ponzinibbio as a win is no longer as impressive as it was 17 months ago. We need to get more from Michel Pereira. Until we do, I'm going to go with Andre Petroski. The next fight is Jonathan Martinez and Adrian Yanez. As I said, I was at 287. And so I saw Yanez fall before the mighty Font, who I said was going to win, albeit by decision. And it was kind of easy to make that call, honestly, because there's so many fans of Yanez. People saying off of that Tony Kelly win that Adrian Yanez has the best boxing in the UFC is ridiculous. The best win the guy had to that point, and still does, is a split decision over Davy Grant. Davy Grant? A split decision? Can't believe it. So it was an easy call for me to go with the guy that had more UFC experience. And here we are again. Now I'm looking at this as the guy who maybe isn't going to be able to match Yanez on, boxing for boxing. Like, Font clearly had better MMA boxing relative to just the straight-up boxing that Yanez offered. But in this spot, you have to believe the hands are going to be the advantages with Yanez. But we've seen Martinez beat guys that are better strikers than him before, that have more tools than him before, that have more tools than what Yanez offers even. Martinez's win over Said Nurmagomedov showed this, in which I said Martinez was going to win at plus 200. I was hoping for a split decision for the Martinez result. Martinez, in fact, got a unanimous decision because he was able to control the fight on the fence, and he did highly effective damage with his elbows. And he demonstrated that he was the better, more well-rounded overall MMA fighter than Nurmagomedov. And I believe he's in a position to do the same thing here against Yanez, which is why I'm a bit surprised that this fight is a pick'em, but I'm grateful for the odds. It seems like they're starting to slowly tilt in favor of Martinez, and I think that makes sense. As I said, Martinez is, much like Font, is not as significant as Font, but has the edge in UFC experience. He also has the edge in late fight experience, and he's also much more consistent in final rounds than Yanez is. It's not just that split decision over Davy Grant that Yanez has. Yanez has 2 unanimous decision wins in his entire UFC career. One of them was in his lone Bellator appearance in 2016. The other one came a few fights afterwards in 2017. Adrian Yanez lost a split decision to Davy Grant. He also lost a split decision to Miles Johns in 2018. He also lost a split decision to Domingo Piarte in 2017. And his first loss of his career was a unanimous decision. So this is a fighter who, although we haven't necessarily seen it take effect yet at the UFC level, this is a fighter that is not a good late round MMA performer. And I'm curious, in fact, if we go look at that Davy Grant, Adrian Yanez result, I will wonder what the rounds were scored like. So I'm going to do that right now, because MMA Decisions is thankfully back up. And it is interesting. It was ambiguous. So two of the judges scored that for Yanez, and Tony Weeks scored it for Davy Grant. Junichiro Kamijo, whose judgment I generally trust, scored it for Yanez for what it's worth. All three of the judges scored the second round for Grant. And two of them scored it the first round for Yanez. Tony Weeks scored it 30-27 Grant, which is interesting. But like I said, we know Martinez is the much more consistent late round performer. We just haven't necessarily seen it from Yanez yet, although that ambiguous final round against Davy Grant serves as a bit of a small sample set, but at least an indicator, because that was the best performance he's had in the UFC relative to strength of competition, and it wasn't an outright victory. So it's interesting that coming off of him getting cracked for the first time in his career against Rob Font, which was an observable step up in competition for Yanez, that he would then be, if he were favored, it would be a bit of an issue. But the fact that it's a pick'em makes me feel better, and now it's moving towards Martinez. I do think that he's being lined appropriately here relative to expectations. That being said, Martinez has been one of my favorite fighters since the very first time that I started doing analysis. It was that first Fight Night event, Makhachev Green, that he was actually right after Ramiz Brahimaj. I picked him to win right before McKinney fought, I believe it was Fares Zayam. And I remember watching Martinez against, I think it was Vince Morales, and looking forward to more opportunities to betting Martinez given the stage of his career he was at. And I was so happy to see him beat Said Nurmagomedov because of that earlier this year. And I think that momentum that he has is going to continue because he's just committed to making himself a more well-rounded fighter in this sport than what we've seen Yanez lean on for success against similar, if not inferior, competition. So give me Jonathan Martinez to pull it out in a pick'em and carry the good momentum forward. And now we come to the main event. Sodiq Yusuff and Edson Barboza. Oh, wow. So, in light of the fact that I've biffed, well, not biffed, but, I correctly called Sean O'Malley to win at UFC 292. Holloway Korean Zombie, I took the over. That barely got proven wrong just because at the start of the third round, Zombie said, all right, I'm going out swinging. Cyril Gahn won at UFC Paris, so I guess I can count that because he wasn't like a 2-1 favorite over Spivak. But yeah, I remembering that he certainly fought like a 400 favorite, which is what everybody said was going to happen. One of these guys is going to look like 400 against the other. And then I got Adesanya Strickland the next week, and I was feeling pretty good about that because I took the plus 4.5. But since then, Kevin Holland was not able to beat Jack Della Maddalena in what I believe was the co-main at UFC Noche. Mateus Gamrot won but was losing and kind of got bailed out on an injury. And last week I tried to hedge on rounds with the plus 4.5 on Dawson Bobby Green, and we saw how that went. So, not my finest times. But, we move on and we try to do better. I did a lot of tape analysis this week for both sides because I wanted to make sure to get this main event pick right because it, since UFC 293, feels like I've gotten either lucky or totally, bad read. Although in both cases it was plus odds. So I try not to have guilt over the plus odds picks, and I usually don't when they're wrong, but in the case of a main event it's a little bit different because they're, the fight the entire card is structured around, and you want to make sure that you get you make the right call. So I did some extra tape study this week starting with Barboza. The thing that really surprised me that I was wondering if it was going to come up in this fight was the bit of guard goblinship that Barboza deployed fighting Bryce Mitchell. I was wondering if it was Mitchell sitting in half guard for most of the fight because I didn't actually get to watch it, even though I graded Mitchell plus 2.5, which was at plus odds to take place, and it did. It also meant I never saw Bryce Mitchell's legendary knockdown, which I did for the first time. I was like, wow, okay, so maybe he does got a little bit of a sting, but he, it was a nice one too. It made me just more wonder about Barboza's damage tolerance as he continues to hang out at featherweight for some indiscernible reason. I think that the knee that he got against Quarantillo has given him a little bit of a lift in terms of what he is still offering at this point. Because his damage tolerance really is not good. And if he's getting outlanded or he gets frustrated, it's easy for Barboza. Barboza's not well-rounded enough to have much to go off of behind swinging wild shots and really throwing out consistent leg kicks to the lead calf. So he, I think that Yusuff, much more well-rounded, although Yusuff has some tendencies that I worry about too, such as a tendency to really jump on guillotines when he thinks they're available. The thing that mostly concerns me is did get kicked in the head against Arnold Allen, and I wonder if he's tightened up those defensive flaws enough to make that not as much of a threat here against Barboza, who's really probably going to be hunting for that, knowing that it's the one thing that has been able to drop this guy that's otherwise not really been knocked out. I think Barboza's paths are very limited here, and I also don't like his tendencies when he gets hurt relative to Yusuff's, because you can go watch the Arnold Allen fight, in which Yusuff took the third round from Arnold Allen unanimously on the scorecards, by the way, and you will see that Yusuff, when he gets hurt, his reaction is to protect himself and to shoot in, sprawl, make himself like in a position where he's not going to be taking damage on the feet. That is maybe not the most aesthetic thing, but in a lot of cases where, it can end up saving a fighter, if for no other reason than they don't get hit, then also the guy tries chasing the finish knowing it's close and ends up gassing himself out doing so. So I think that you look at what Yusuff does, he knows how to get himself away from taking more damage when he's already been damaged. You compare that to how Barboza got knocked out in the Chikadze fight. You saw him starting to cover against the fence a little bit, but keeping himself off of it. The bigger issue was when he got stung again. He tried trading with Chikadze, and he's not a takedown guy, so he just didn't really have anything available to counter Chikadze with, and Chikadze was able to finish him. His coaches pointed out to him as much in the corner Chikadze's did between rounds. So Barboza just doesn't have the tool set well-rounded here, I think, to give Yusuff significant problems. I am going to be worried about the head kicks and the knees, and it is a bit of a concern. I also am concerned about Yusuff's ring rust, just because it's the same thing I said with Pereira. Whether it's unfortunate circumstances or not, the reality is it keeps guys out of the octagon, and his last performance against Yanez was an 1,100 favorite, and that fight lasted 30 seconds. So it probably didn't even feel real to him, which, maybe it did because he got punched in the torso a few times. Anyway, I'm going to say that Yusuff gets the knockout in round 3 here since this is a 5-round fight. I think that he takes a round to kind of figure out what he needs to really keep on lock defensively to avoid getting caught in any traps from Barboza. And then as he starts to open up a bit, Barboza's damage tolerance is just totally shot at this point. And I don't think it's going to take much from a fighter like Yusuff, who has one punch lights out power, or really any other fighter for that matter that enjoys clinch work and elbows and getting gritty. I think that Barboza, it's almost certain that he's going to be wearing damage at some point in this fight. And you have to wonder that the longer it goes, if it is going to go to decision, is he just going to end up fading again against a younger guy that has a more promising immediate future? So give me Sodiq Yusuff to win. And I believe his price right now is, let me check. It's 162. So go ahead and get him at that. I think he's very playable at that price. I wouldn't play him out past 200, but actually, no. You know what? I would. I really do like him in this spot. I think he has more paths to win. I might be overplaying my hand a little bit here. Red Barboza could get lucky with another knee or something, but I'd feel much better about Yusuff if he weren't off of so much ring rust. But at the end of the day, I think he's got a better career trajectory at this point than Barboza does. He'll have the age gap, I believe, in his favor as well. Let me confirm that. Yeah, Yusuff is 30, Barboza's 37. So I think with the age gap, too, that'll be key also. So give me Sodiq Yusuff, round 3 knockout. I could see a decision as well. But if he gets it done, I think he takes a round or 2 to diagnose and then deploys once Barboza is a little bit deeper in the waters than maybe even he expects. And that is going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD this week. I will be back next week for UFC 294, which is now suddenly Makhachev-Volkanovski 2. I'll have a very funny story about Charles Oliveira pay-per-view cancellations for next week. because I did go to 274, and I was about 6 hours outside of Phoenix when a certain belt got taken off a certain person by a certain commission that wants to use certain non-electronic scales. Ridiculous. This time it's totally on Charles, though. So my condolences to the fans. Looks like there's some other good fights on that card, although it seems we're about to lose Kosta Kamaev, which is really tragic. But that wasn't a good fight for betting purposes anyway, so perhaps they can give us something better. In any event, back next week for 294. Thank you very much for tuning into the MMA RAXPOD. Please like, share, and subscribe on Twitter and YouTube. And we'll bounce back at some point. Sooner rather than later, ideally. But thank you very much for sticking around the whole way. And also, big moment last week, hitting 1,000 followers. Thank you so much for that. It really does mean a lot. And it puts me in a position now where I'm starting to think there's enough of an audience that this the content platform for this place can launch sooner rather than later. And I look forward to having you all around for it when the day comes. But in due time, one step at a time. Got some bankroll to recoup this week. So let's hit the ground running. And I look forward to hitting it with you all. I'm going to be at a wedding this weekend as well. So might be a little touch and go with the picks, reporting on them on Saturday because I'll just be with family. But Friday morning I am going to try to be attentive for the weigh-ins, have my picks all scheduled into Friday night. Ceremony is Friday evening, so I probably won't be. I mean, I'm never around Friday anyway, but I'm going to try to get them scheduled for Friday, but if not, you can expect to see them throughout the day Saturday, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So thank you very much for tuning in, and back next week for UFC 294. Take care, folks. Always a pleasure.